This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter, Chairman of NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's show. We're going to be talking about executive comp and particularly sort of understanding management's views. It's a topic that we really haven't dealt with on the show so far. And with me as our resident expert to talk about this, welcome David Swinford, who's the president and CEO of Meyer and Partners and a longtime associate with Corporate Board Member. So welcome, Dave.
Thanks, TK. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I don't have to tell you that comp committees have certainly changed in their focus over the last 3, 4, 5 years. And who'd have ever thought that we'd be sitting here saying that people would rather serve on the audit committee than the comp committee. So that tells you that a lot has changed, because that has never been the case. So we're going to talk about this issue with understanding management's views on pay. But let's start, first of all, let's set a foundation. I think the best place to set that foundation is for me to ask you sort of the foremost responsibility that the compensation committee has in your view.
I think the main responsibility of a compensation committee is to attract and retain a great management team that can carry out the company's mission and achieve its strategic objectives. That requires using compensation from a competitive perspective to find the right people and bring them in. It requires aligning compensation with the achievement of those strategic objectives. That may or may not look exactly like aligning compensation with total shareholder return that many of the people on the outside are asking for. I think it does require a focus on the top management leadership team as opposed to just on the CEO, where I think we typically told comp committees to focus.
So, with all your years of experience, you've obviously had a lot of CEOs that you've had discussions participating with. What is their first priority from your experience in them judging their own pay?
Yeah. Let me expand that to being the complete management team as just opposed to the CEO. I think that managers are like the rest of us. And sometimes we forget that, and compensation committee members forget that even the leaders of organizations react to compensation and react to other decisions made about them in the same way that most employees do. And most people want to be treated fairly. And I think that fairly means that as my responsibilities increase over time, my compensation opportunities increase over time. Further, I have some control over how I'm paid. So there are standard rules in the process. You know, I understand the roadmap to how compensation works. And so I know that these goals, if achieved, will result in these kinds of payments. So clearly playing by the rules that are set in the plans. But the goals need to be within what I call the substantial influence of the executives. Because they can't control everything. They can't control all the outcomes. But if you can substantially impact it, you'll think that it's fair to be paid for that. So I think it's an awful lot about fairness and fair treatment. I also think about consistent treatment over time. So if I performed in this way last year and I got paid X, and I performed in this way and a little better this year, I would expect, logically, to be paid a little bit more than X. And if those things don't happen, then I think people start to worry about whether or not their pay is fair. I think whether or not it's competitive, that is, it fits the market, actually comes after all of those other things, although you can't pay people under the market for a very long time and have them continue with you, because other people will seek them out and hire them instead.
Well, and don't take this the wrong way, you've been in this business for a long time. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you have seen changes where over that time where the CEO participated a lot in the process of determining their pay to, I'm sure what we see today is, that resides probably more in the board of directors these days than ever before. So you witnessed that evolution?
Absolutely. In the old days, the CEO would tell his HR person what he wanted to get in terms of compensation, and the HR person would go tell the comp committee, and that's what it would be. And that's long gone. The CEO still is the key driver of the pay recommendations for the people who report to him or her, because the compensation program is the CEO's key tool for communicating with the organization what needs to get done and what the rewards are for doing it. But when it comes to the CEO's pay, her pay, his pay is really very much done at this point by the compensation committee, usually in the process of a dialogue with the CEO so that you know how the CEO is going to receive the pay decisions, but a lot more involvement of outside consultants like me, a lot more discussions with lead directors and other board members to make those pay decisions in a more objective way.
So what are the specific questions that executive asks on deciding whether they've been paid, to your word, fairly or what they deserved? And if not, what questions do they ask about how is this going to right itself?
Yeah, I think in terms of is my comp fair, what were my expectations based upon my performance and knowing the system as I do? And did I get that or not? And even if you give somebody more than that, even if they go away happy, they go away with questions. So you got to have that kind of consistency. I think there is an element in there of, am I being treated comparably to my peers within the organization? And then third, there is this question of, is it competitively externally? If I don't get what I expect, then I think my questions are, if the reason I didn't get what I expected is because the company is doing poorly, I think there's a whole assessment of, can the company recover? Can it do well? Can I make a contribution to that? When and if I do that, would I get rewarded for that? And if I can't, then I probably look for a job elsewhere, right? The second is my function or business unit really taken seriously, being treated consistently with the others? If I'm a part of a function that is not as respected as I think it ought to be, what can I do to change that? If I can't change it, I'm likely to think about going somewhere else. Do I feel like I personally am being treated fairly? Am I getting along with my boss? If you don't get along with your boss and you think your boss has it in for you, it almost doesn't matter how other things work. If you're going to work for that person, you're going to suffer. And so if you feel like your boss has got the bad impression of you, then can I change that? Can I get a different boss? If I can't, I'm probably going to leave. So I think those are assessments of what people are going through. Some people will certainly accept what they view is lower compensation than they think is really appropriate for where they are. And I think when they do that, they're looking at, do I like my job? Do I like my colleagues? Do I love my boss? Is this a great place to come to work every day? Do I get up and really look forward to going there? Am I learning and growing? If somebody still feels like they have something to learn on a particular job, they're likely to stick it out through some very difficult times to get that experience and that knowledge, even if it's simply to sell it to somebody else and get a different job, but it's worth doing. And I think that the third thing is, am I proud to be a part of this organization? Do I like being here because being a part of this organization somehow makes me feel better? It gives me a sense of fulfillment, and I think that's very important to a lot of people. Then there's the whole geography thing. And I work with a number of clients that are in places that this time of year are snowbound. And they always talk about how difficult it is to attract people. But there's actually a group of people that like winter outdoor sports. I'm not one of them, but and there are groups of people that like hunting and fishing, and so the upper Midwest looks good to them. And there are other people that want to live in New York City no matter what, and so they'll make those decisions, and they are a factor in what they look at, and when they choose to stay someplace or leave someplace as well.
Well, you brought up an important point, and that's growth in a job. So, how important, again, in your opinion, is the executive's weight on sort of non-monetary issues like growth and development?
I think it's very important, but I think it's actually something that boards and compensation committees have not consistently come to grips with in terms of how to present that value. So somebody can sit there in a job and say, I'm really learning a lot. I'm going to stick this out another couple of years because I can see these following things that will enable me to grow. But if you rely on them to discover that, it may or may not be a good retention element. Whereas if you've got a pretty formal management development program and you sit down and talk with the executives on a regular basis about what their developmental needs are and what you are doing to help them meet them and what their next assignment is going to be, they're going to put a lot more value on that process. So I'm starting to see a lot of compensation committees now really start to focus on what is our development process for the next generation of executives, because they know that to the extent that you really make that explicit, you'll get value out of that growth opportunity with an executive.
Well, and that brings us, that's a great segue to our $64,000 question, which is what this show is all about. And we want to give advice to the board, to the directors on the board. So how, you just mentioned now about the interviews, but how does a director go about gathering this intelligence about pay attitudes, about development attitudes, about all that? And then how far should a board go down? I mean, you hear a lot of different stories about how far down the organization they should go. So here's our opportunity to pass along some key advice to our viewers.
Well, here's some thoughts, and I don't know if these thoughts work for every organization, but here's some thoughts based upon what I've seen with a number of companies. The first thing, of course, I think is every director should realize that rarely will a dissatisfied executive be fully candid with them. And the ones who are being fully candid have probably already made up their minds that they probably don't want to be around much longer, and so they're proactively giving you the exit interview. But I think that as a director wants to start to look at pay and whether or not people perceive pay to be fair, you can arm yourself with all the facts. So know what competitive pay is, even though that's an external factor. More importantly, know how the compensation program has been operating in the company, especially as it distinguishes rewards for different business units and different functional areas, so that you really understand how executives are being treated differently, not just individually, but based upon their unit or function within the organization. And then when you see them, and you got to do this, I think, when you're just normally interacting with them as opposed to making an appointment to do it, because an appointment to do it makes it too big a deal. But when you're interacting, start to ask them things about how do the incentive plans work for them as a manager in motivating and properly rewarding their direct reports. I find that if you get an executive talking about how the plan works as a management tool for their people, you will end up getting some results that are really useful to know, but you'll also get a reflection about how they feel on the other side of the issue. And in follow-up questions, when somebody identifies a problem, the expansion on that will usually get somebody to open up a little bit and share with you their personal feelings about things. Management development, I think, is pretty similar, although if somebody is in a group that is consciously being developed and they know it, you can typically talk to them very directly about that, because that's not money. And people are much more willing to talk openly about what they aspire to in terms of professional contributions over time. And they're also recognizing that their development is a company investment. So it's much easier to talk about than just your compensation in general. But even there, if you talk about how the program works as a tool for the troops, you'll get a lot of good information that will help you understand how those executives are perceiving the program and how it works for them.
Well, having been a CEO generations ago, I know that I had a lot of focus on the board worrying about me, and I'll worry about my team. I see changes that are occurring with that, particularly as people are looking down the line to develop managers and senior officers of the future. I think there's much more board sort of participation, if you will, and stuff like that. So
a great CEO without a strong team is pretty helpless, and a strong team without a really good CEO is pretty helpless. So I think the board needs to worry about both, and we've learned painfully is that not all CEOs are great developers of other people.
And a board without board leadership is relatively helpless. So
absolutely.
We've just stressed that leadership is a pretty
critical.
Pretty critical element. Well, listen, David, thank you very much for joining us. It was great to cover this topic, which we hadn't before. And that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week and take a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. And we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom. Brought to you by NYSE Governance Services, Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.